On the afternoon of July 14th, 2026, thousands of Dell laptop owners around the world watched their screens go black without warning. No error message, no blue screen, no fan spin down to signal something was wrong. One moment their computer was running normally, the next it had simply switched itself off, mid-sentence, mid-spreadsheet, mid-video call, as if someone had reached behind the machine and yanked the power cord out of the wall. For the people it happened to, the first instinct was panic. Was it a hardware failure, a battery about to die permanently, a virus, something worse? What almost nobody suspected, at least not right away, was that the culprit was sitting inside the very update that was supposed to be protecting their machine. Microsoft has now confirmed it officially. A routine Windows 11 security update collided with a driver already installed on certain Dell computers. And the collision caused those machines to shut down without warning, overheat, slow to a crawl, and burn through battery life at an alarming rate. This is not speculation pulled from an online forum thread. It is a documented, acknowledged conflict confirmed by both Microsoft and Dell, with a real fix already released. And if you own a Dell PC running Windows 11, the next few minutes could save you from a very confusing, very frustrating afternoon. Here's the short version before we dig into exactly how this happened, because you deserve to know where this story is going before we walk through the details. A routine security update for Windows 11 ended up conflicting with a driver on certain Dell computers. The conflict caused those specific machines to shut down unexpectedly, overheat, perform poorly, and drain their batteries far faster than normal. Microsoft caught it, blocked the update from reaching the affected devices before the problem could spread any further, and then released an emergency fix roughly 4 days later. If you own a Dell running Windows 11, this is worth paying close attention to, because there is a real chance it has already affected you. And there's a remarkably simple way to check right now. To understand how this actually unfolded, you need to start with the timeline, because the sequence of events here matters enormously. Back in June of 2026, Microsoft released an optional preview update for Windows 11 carrying the identifier KB509593. This was not a mandatory patch pushed to every user automatically. It was one of those optional early access updates that Windows periodically makes available to people who want to test upcoming features before they roll out broadly. The kind of update typically downloaded by IT professionals, enthusiasts, and early adopters, rather than the average user. Buried inside that seemingly routine update was a change to something called the Windows USB-C Connection Manager, the system component responsible for handling how a computer communicates with devices and power sources through its USB-C ports, including charging behavior and device detection. On paper, that sounds like a small, forgettable technical adjustment. It was not. That new USB-C Connection Manager interface ended up clashing directly with a driver already installed on a large number of Dell computers, specifically the Intel Innovation Platform Framework Processor Participant Driver. That name is a mouthful, but understanding what this driver actually does is the key to the entire story. This is not some minor, forgettable background process running quietly and doing nothing important. The Processor Participant Driver is a core system-level driver responsible for managing your processor's power behavior and thermal behavior. In plain terms, it is part of the system that decides how much power your CPU draws, how the machine manages heat buildup, and how it throttles performance to avoid overheating or draining the battery too quickly. When Windows introduced its new USB-C Connection Manager in that June preview update, it created a conflict with this driver on a specific set of Dell machines, and when a driver responsible for managing power and heat gets knocked out of sync, the resulting symptoms are exactly what people started reporting: shutdowns, overheating, poor performance, and rapid battery drain. It lines up with disturbing precision because you are essentially left with a computer that has lost its ability to properly regulate its own power and its own temperature. At that point, back in June, the problem was still relatively contained. KB509593 was optional, and most everyday users never go out of their way to install preview updates. For a few weeks, this conflict sat quietly in the background, affecting a smaller pool of machines without becoming a widespread mainstream story. Then July arrived, and everything changed. On July 14th, 2026, as part of that month's regular Patch Tuesday cycle, Microsoft released KB51016550, a mandatory cumulative update for Windows 11 covering both the 24.8.2 and 25.8.2 versions. Patch Tuesday updates are not optional. They roll out automatically to virtually every Windows 11 device on the planet because they typically contain critical security fixes that need to reach users quickly. And this particular update was a significant one. It pushed affected systems up to build 26G200.88875 and closed a record 570 security vulnerabilities in a single release. It also introduced a new feature called Point-in-Time Restore, designed to make it easier to roll a system back to a previous working state if something goes wrong, which, in a strange twist of timing, is exactly the kind of safety net you would want available when an update like this one starts causing real problems. For the overwhelming majority of Windows 11 users, this update installed exactly the way it was designed to. No issues, no drama, just routine security patching running quietly in the background while people went about their day, completely unaware anything unusual was happening on their machines. But for a specific subset of Dell computers, the ones that already carried that underlying Intel processor participant driver conflict left behind from the June preview update, installing KB51016550 triggered the exact chain of problems described a moment ago. Unexpected shutdowns, poor performance, increased heat, battery drain. All 4 symptoms were confirmed directly by Microsoft itself, not just anecdotal complaints scattered across online forums and social media threads. There was actually a very specific, very visible way people could tell whether their machine had been caught in this conflict. And this detail is worth knowing if you want to check your own system right now. On impacted devices, Windows Device Manager displayed a yellow exclamation point next to the Intel Innovation Platform Framework Processor Participant Driver. That small yellow warning icon is Windows' built-in way of flagging that a piece of hardware or a driver is not functioning correctly. If a user saw that icon sitting next to that specific driver, that was the visible fingerprint of this exact bug quietly running on their machine, whether or not they had experienced a shutdown yet. So how did Microsoft even discover the problem in the first place? This part is genuinely reassuring because it shows a system working roughly the way it is supposed to. Dell itself reported the issue to Microsoft during internal testing, and together the two companies traced the root cause to an incompatibility between the Intel driver and the new Windows USB-C Connection Manager interface introduced in that June 23rd preview update. In other words, this was not discovered after thousands of frustrated users flooded support forums with complaints. It was caught, at least in part, through the kind of pre-release testing and vendor coordination that exists specifically to catch problems like this before they spread too widely across the user base. That coordination between Dell and Microsoft turned out to be critical for what happened next. Once Microsoft fully understood the scope of the problem, they made a decision that, frankly, more companies should make more often when something like this surfaces. Instead of letting the buggy update continue rolling out to every Dell machine carrying the vulnerable driver, Microsoft blocked KB51016550 from being offered to those specific affected devices. The update effectively paused itself for anyone running the vulnerable Intel driver. If your Dell PC fell into that category, Windows Update simply would not offer you the July security patch. Not because your internet connection was broken, not because something was wrong with your Microsoft account, but because Microsoft was deliberately withholding it to prevent your machine from experiencing the same shutdown and overheating problems other affected users were already reporting. This is an important distinction worth sitting with for a moment. If you were one of the people staring at Windows Update, confused about why your Dell laptop was not receiving the latest patch, while a friend's identical-looking machine was updating just fine, it was not a glitch, and it was not something wrong on your end. It was a deliberate safeguard. Microsoft explicitly stated at the time that it was working directly with Dell to prevent affected models from experiencing the issue, and that a resolution was planned within the coming days. That is, a company catching a problem in the middle of a rollout and hitting the brakes before it could get worse for everyone else, which, to be fair, is a genuinely good outcome compared to the alternative of simply letting the update keep spreading unchecked across every vulnerable machine. Of course, blocking the update created its own tension, and this part deserves attention too, because it was not a simple, easy decision on Microsoft's end. Remember that KB51016550 was not just some random, forgettable update. It closed 570 security vulnerabilities in a single release, and that is not a small number by any measure. Every single day that update remained blocked on affected Dell machines was another day those specific systems stayed exposed to security flaws that had already been patched on every other Windows 11 device on the planet. So, Microsoft found itself balancing two very real risks against each other. The risk of shutdowns and hardware stress caused by a driver conflict weighed against the risk of leaving hundreds of known vulnerabilities unpatched on a subset of machines. There was no version of the situation where Microsoft could avoid all risk entirely. They had to choose which danger was more urgent to address first, and they chose to prioritize system stability over immediate patching for the affected machines, while racing behind the scenes to get an actual fix ready as quickly as possible. And they moved fast. Just 4 days after publicly confirming the issue on July 18th, 2026, Microsoft released an out-of-band emergency update specifically built to resolve this exact conflict. Out-of-band, for anyone unfamiliar with the term, simply means an update released outside the normal monthly patch schedule, essentially an emergency release rather than something users had to wait weeks for until the next scheduled Patch Tuesday. This particular fix arrived in 2 versions depending on which build of Windows 11 a given machine was running. KB51-21767 and KB51-21768. Both were engineered to directly resolve the shutdown causing driver conflict on the affected Dell machines. Here's something genuinely convenient about how this fix was packaged. And it is worth mentioning because it eliminates a common source of confusion during situations like this one. KB51-21767 is cumulative, meaning it does not require a user to already have some earlier update installed first. It bundles everything needed into a single install. For anyone whose device had been held back from July's original security update because of the vulnerable Intel driver, the system now offers KB51-21767 in place of the original KB51-1650. That means those affected devices get caught up on the month's security protections and get the underlying driver conflict resolved at the same time in one single installation, rather than needing multiple separate updates installed in a specific sequence. So, practically speaking, if you own a Dell computer running Windows 11 and you are wondering whether any of this actually applies to you, here's the simple way to check right now. Open Windows Update in your Settings app and look at what is currently being offered to your machine. If your system was one of the affected devices, you should now see KB51-21767 or KB51-21768 listed instead of the original KB51-1650. Installing it should resolve the underlying driver conflict while also catching your system up on this month's security fixes. If you want to double-check the specific driver issue before or after installing the fix, you can open Device Manager and look for that Intel Innovation Platform Framework Processor Participant Driver directly. If there is a yellow exclamation point sitting next to it, that is the visual signature of the problem. After installing the fix and restarting, that warning icon should clear. One more genuinely useful piece of practical advice worth mentioning here, and it applies far beyond just this one bug. It is worth keeping a healthy amount of free space on your main system drive, generally at least around 20 gigabytes, because updates need room to install properly. And just as importantly, room to roll back cleanly if something goes wrong during the process. A surprising number of update failures that get blamed entirely on a bad update are actually caused, at least in part, by a system drive that is nearly full, which does not leave Windows enough breathing room to complete the installation process correctly. It is a small thing to check, but it can genuinely save you a serious headache down the line. Now let's talk about what to do if you are still seeing shutdowns even after installing the fix, because that distinction matters, and it is worth understanding clearly. If your Dell PC started experiencing unexpected shutdowns within days of installing July's Windows update, the driver conflict described here is by far the most likely explanation. It is a known, confirmed, publicly documented issue, not some rare coincidence unique to your machine. However, if you have already installed KB51-21767 and you're still experiencing the same shutdowns, overheating, or battery problems afterward, at that point the driver conflict becomes a much less likely explanation, and you are probably looking at an actual underlying hardware issue instead, something worth reaching out to Dell support about directly, since a genuine hardware fault would need to be diagnosed and handled separately from a software patch. To summarize the sequence cleanly, Dell reported the issue to Microsoft. Microsoft confirmed the root cause through joint investigation, and rather than letting the buggy update keep spreading unchecked, Microsoft deliberately blocked it from reaching affected machines while a proper fix was developed. 4 days later, that fix arrived as an emergency out-of-band update, cumulative and fully self-contained, rolling both the month's security protections and the driver fix into a single installation. If there is a broader lesson buried inside all of this, it is a reminder of just how deeply interconnected modern computers really are underneath the surface. A change to how your laptop manages a USB-C port ended up affecting how your CPU manages heat and power, which ended up causing computers to shut themselves off entirely without warning. None of these systems exist in isolation from one another. They are all wired together under the hood in ways that are not obvious from the outside, and sometimes a small, well-intentioned change made in one corner of that system can ripple outward into consequences nobody predicted or intended. The reassuring part in this particular case is that the system built to catch and fix that kind of problem actually worked the way it is supposed to. A vendor flagged the issue, the platform maker investigated it, the two companies coordinated on a response, they protected the specific users at risk by holding back the problematic update, and then they shipped a real, working fix within days rather than weeks. Let's go a bit deeper into why this particular combination, Dell hardware, an Intel driver, and a Windows update, turned into a problem in the first place, because there is a larger pattern here worth understanding if you want to grasp why bugs like this keep happening across the PC industry. Modern laptops are not built by a single company from top to bottom the way a smartphone often is. Dell designs and assembles the physical machine, But the processor inside nearly all of these affected devices comes from Intel, and the operating system running on top of all of it comes from Microsoft. That means every single Dell PC with an Intel chip running Windows is actually the product of 3 different companies' software and hardware, all interacting together simultaneously, each one updating its own piece on its own independent schedule. Intel writes and updates the drivers that let Windows communicate properly with the processor. Microsoft writes and updates Windows itself, including how it manages hardware connections like USB-C. And Dell layers its own management software and firmware on top of both of those foundations. Under normal circumstances, this entire system works fine, because all 3 companies test their updates against a wide range of hardware configurations before releasing anything publicly. But every so often, a change made by one company interacts badly with something built by another company in a way that nobody fully anticipated, simply because no single company controls or fully understands every layer of the stack at once. That is precisely what happened here. Microsoft's engineers were working on modernizing how Windows handles USB-C connections, a completely forward-looking, reasonable project, given that USB-C has become the standard port for charging, display output, and data transfer across nearly all modern laptops today. But somewhere in the process of building that new connection manager interface, it started interacting with system resources that the Intel processor participant driver also depends on to manage power and heat. Neither company necessarily did anything obviously wrong in isolation. Microsoft's new interface presumably worked fine entirely on its own, and Intel's driver had presumably been stable for a long stretch of time before this conflict emerged. It was specifically the interaction between the two on specific Dell hardware configurations that caused the actual failure. This is one of the fundamental structural challenges of the entire PC industry, and it is worth understanding because it explains why these kinds of bugs are not rare, isolated incidents. They are a recurring category of problem that resurfaces again and again across different manufacturers in different years. Unlike a smartphone, where a single company like Apple controls the hardware, the chip, and the software all at once under one roof, a typical Windows PC is assembled from parts and software written by dozens of different companies, all trying to coordinate their release schedules and testing processes without full visibility into everyone else's underlying code. It is genuinely impressive that this sprawling, decentralized system works as smoothly as it usually does, and it is also fairly predictable that every so often something slips through the cracks in exactly this way. It is also worth examining how this specific incident got resolved so quickly, because the speed of the fix here is a useful case study in what a well-handled response actually looks like in practice. From the moment Microsoft publicly confirmed the issue to the moment they shipped a fully working out-of-band fix, only 4 days passed. That is an extremely fast turnaround for a problem this serious, and it did not happen by accident. It happened because Dell had already flagged the issue to Microsoft during its own internal testing process, which meant Microsoft was not starting from zero the moment the wider rollout began causing visible problems for users. They already had a meaningful head start on understanding the root cause before it became a bigger, messier public story. That is the real value of the ongoing relationship between hardware manufacturers and Microsoft's Windows engineering teams. When that relationship functions well, problems get caught and communicated internally before they spiral into something far more chaotic and damaging. It is also worth noting what Microsoft chose not to do here, because the alternative response would have been considerably worse for everyone involved. Microsoft could have simply let the July security update continue rolling out to every Dell machine, including the ones carrying the vulnerable driver, and dealt with the fallout afterward through a flood of support tickets and negative headlines. Instead, they made the more difficult, more responsible choice, temporarily withholding a mandatory security update from a subset of devices, even though that meant leaving those specific machines exposed to unpatched vulnerabilities for a few extra days. That is a real trade-off, and it is one worth sitting with for a moment, because it demonstrates that pausing a rollout is never free action. It carries a genuine cost, and Microsoft accepted that cost deliberately in order to avoid a worse outcome for the users who were already affected. Now let's walk through the practical side of things a bit more thoroughly, because if you actually own one of these machines, the theory behind the bug matters far less than knowing exactly what steps to take. First, checking whether your device was ever affected in the first place. If you are currently running a Dell laptop or desktop with an Intel processor on Windows 11, in either the 24H2 or 25H2 version, you fall into the category of machines that could have been impacted by this conflict. The clearest sign that the bug was actively affecting your system would have been that yellow exclamation point in Device Manager next to the Intel Innovation Platform Framework Processor Participant Driver. To check this yourself, open Device Manager, look under the System Devices or Processors category depending on how your specific machine organizes its hardware list, and search for that driver name specifically. If there is no warning icon next to it and your system has been running normally, There is a good chance you either never had the June preview update installed, or your specific device simply was not part of the affected subset to begin with. Second, if you were affected and your Windows update had been held back, you do not need to do anything complicated to resolve it. Simply open Settings, go to Windows Update, and check for updates. If your device was on the block list because of this issue, it should now be offering you KB512.1767 or KB512.1768 instead of the original KB5101650. Since that fix is cumulative, you do not need to hunt down and install any earlier updates first. Installing the new one brings your system fully up to date, security patches and driver fix included in a single step. Third, and this part is genuinely important, after installing the fix, give your system a little bit of time and a full restart before jumping to any conclusions if you are still nervous about shutdowns happening again. Driver-related fixes sometimes need a complete reboot to properly take effect, since drivers get loaded during the boot process rather than while Windows is already actively running. If you have restarted and you are still seeing the same shutdown behavior after the fix has been installed and given time to settle, that is the point where it stops being reasonable to blame this specific software bug, and it becomes worth reaching out to Dell support directly, since a persistent issue at that stage is more likely pointing toward an actual hardware fault rather than the driver conflict this particular fix was designed to resolve. There is one more piece of good general advice buried inside the reporting around this incident that is worth passing along, because it applies well beyond just this single bug. Keeping a healthy amount of free space on your main system drive, generally at least around 20 gigabytes free, makes a real, measurable difference in how reliably updates install, and just as importantly, how cleanly they can roll back if something does go wrong during the process. Windows needs breathing room during an update to stage files, create backups of the current system state, and safely swap in the new version without corrupting anything along the way. A nearly full drive does not give it that room, and a surprising number of update failures that get blamed entirely on buggy updates are actually made worse, or in some cases directly caused by insufficient free space sitting available on the drive. It is a simple thing to check periodically, and it costs you nothing to glance at your available storage every once in a while. Stepping back one more time, it is worth placing this whole episode into the broader context of how often this kind of thing happens across the Windows ecosystem, because it helps calibrate exactly how alarmed you should actually be. This is not the first time in 2026 that an optional preview update introduced a change that later caused problems once it got folded into a mandatory release further down the line. The pattern, a quiet change introduced in an optional update, followed by wider fallout once a mandatory patch builds on top of it, has shown up more than once this year across different parts of the Windows ecosystem. It is a useful reminder that optional does not always mean irrelevant, because changes introduced quietly in preview, updates do not simply disappear afterward. They often become the foundation for future mandatory updates, carrying whatever hidden conflicts they introduced along with them into the next release. To bring this all together into one clear picture, an optional Windows 11 preview update released in June 2026 introduced a new way of managing USB-C connections, which conflicted with a critical Intel driver responsible for power and thermal management on certain Dell computers. The conflict stayed relatively contained while the update remained optional and limited to a smaller pool of early adopters. Then, Microsoft's mandatory July 2026 security update, which fixed 570 vulnerabilities and reached the vast majority of Windows 11 users without a single issue, triggered that same underlying conflict at a much larger scale, specifically on the affected Dell machines, causing real confirmed unexpected shutdowns, overheating, poor performance, and battery drain. Dell and Microsoft identified the root cause together through direct coordination. Microsoft blocked the update from reaching vulnerable devices, while a fix was developed behind the scenes, and 4 days later shipped a cumulative, self-contained emergency update that resolved the driver conflict while still delivering that month's full security protections. If you own an affected Dell machine, the entire fix is already available and sitting there waiting for you right now. You simply need to check Windows Update and install it. And if you have been quietly wondering for the past couple of weeks why your Dell laptop seemed to be shutting itself off, running unusually hot, or draining its battery faster than it used to, now you know exactly why it happened, and you know exactly what to do about it.